Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to be in these sorts of events. I always love to come and speak to young people. I'm really sorry my voice is a bit husky last night. We were in meetings very late, so I'm kind of I'm a little bit dead. But I'll do my best for you today. So yeah, as Youngjin kindly introduced me, my name is Jack. I'm currently working for the Global Green Growth Institute, which is based in Seoul. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about SDG 12, so responsible consumption and production. I'm sure you guys know quite a lot about it already. So what I'm going to try to do today is kind of draw out some ideas from you, some ideas about what the big problems are, what some solutions might be. And I also want to give you some solutions from what I've seen as well in the field, working with GGGI. We don't directly target the SDGs, but of course we keep these sorts of goals in our mind when we implement our projects and when we design things. So we're going to go through that today. There's quite a lot of you here, so I'm very happy that I set up some online interaction platform, which I'll introduce in a minute. But I want to start, I always like to start these presentations by talking about this image that I've got in the background. Normally I'd ask if any of you know where this is, but there's quite a lot of you here, so it might be a bit scary for you to speak up in front of everybody. But let me introduce it myself. This image here is from a place called the Aral Sea, which is in Uzbekistan. This lake used to be the fourth largest lake in the world until 1960. And it's now a fraction of its original size, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And why am I talking to you about this? Well, the disappearance of this lake is really the epitome of irresponsible consumption and irresponsible production. Water diverted from the rivers that fed this lake to grow cotton in an area which is extremely arid, low precipitation, not much water availability, and of course cotton being one of the most water intensive crops around. So this really is something that we would talk about in the frame of irresponsible consumption production. And the other reason I like this image is because this guy at the bottom, he's kind of strolling around as though nothing ever happened here. And I really feel like this is indicative of a lot of the attitudes that we have towards our irresponsible consumption, irresponsible production, towards climate change and the impending disaster that we face. We kind of walk blindly into it and put our hands in the pockets and, give somebody else the responsibility without taking it on ourselves. So yeah, just wanted to introduce that to you today. So let me introduce to you now the platform that I'm going to use to try and interact with you all throughout today's session. This is one that I really like. It's really easy to use. It's called Slido. So as we go through today, I'm going to ask you some questions and stuff like that. And instead of asking you to raise your hands all the time, I'm going to ask you to interact through Slido. So you can either join the Slido room that we're going to be using by scanning the QR code, which is on the screen at the moment. You can scan that with your smartphone. Or you can go to slido.com. and you can join the room using code SDG12, and that'll put you in the session that we're going to be using. If you have some technical problems, normally we have a couple of people for who this doesn't work. If that's you today, don't worry about it. Use the chat in the Zoom room instead. I'll try and keep my eye on that. I'm not very good at it, but I'll try. And we'll go through the session in that way. I'm going to ask you now to test Slido to make sure that you're all able to use it. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to scan the QR code and go to the room. And let's see for how many of you it's working. So you can either say hi, it will appear on your screen now. You can either say hi or you can give me some examples of irresponsible production and irresponsible consumption. I'll leave it up to you what you want to do. I know it's early in the morning, so you might just want to take the easy option and say hi. But if you do want to give me some examples, I'd love to see those. So yeah, cool. We've got somebody's typed SDG 12. That's the session of today's thing. Hello, nice to meet you, whoever said that. We've got one other person typing, two more people typing. I know there's about 36 of you in here, so hopefully we'll see that number go up. Is anybody having issues with it? If so, please say so in the Zoom meeting chat. I'll keep that open. We've got some people typing, probably some examples of, oh yeah, hi, Amazon rainforest. Yes, the Amazon rainforest is one of the biggest issues in responsible consumption. Got lots of highs, lots of hellos. Nice to meet you. Hi, guys. Any other examples of irresponsible production or consumption that you could think of? Please feel free to type it. Amazon rainforest is a great example. We'll probably stay here for another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll move along. Got some people typing. There are many examples. Yeah, there are so many examples. You're quite right. Let's see, meat diet, the infamous meat diet, yes, can definitely be an example of this. Clothes, yes, we're going to talk about clothes later, actually, so thank you for bringing that up. All right, let's see, swamps, yep, and overpackaging, awesome. All right, I'm going to move on from here, so sorry if anybody's still typing. We're on a bit of a tight schedule, so I ask for your understanding on that. Let me go very quickly through who I am, just so you know. This is me, I'm Jack. Originally, I'm from the very infamous United Kingdom. I'm sure you've all heard about that. Don't ask me how it's going, because it's not going very well. Luckily for me, though, I live in Seoul, so I get to ignore those problems for a little bit. Stuff that I really like football. I really like Chelsea. Any Tottenham fans in here? I'm very sorry to you guys. But it's just the way it is. Yeah, editing videos, I like memes and stuff like that. Swimming, blah blah blah. Education wise, I started university 10 years ago, which is super scary, and graduated recently, just earlier this year. And in terms of my career, yeah, as Peter said, I'm working at the moment with GGGI, but I also do some work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Korea. And I've done some stuff for the World Bank as well. So hopefully bringing some of those examples and those experiences to help you guys today. And then I always like to talk about this a little as well. Well, why be in this sector in the first place? It's a very challenging arena. There's a lot of pushback. It's not easy to get things done. And there's a lot of sensitivity to overcome, whether that's cultural, political, economic, so on and so forth. It's very difficult. But why did I choose it? Well, I'm going to sort of simplify what I've put here and say that it came down to a combination of all of these things that you can see on the left. So people talking to me about these issues when I was very young, including my parents, my teachers, my professors, and then, you know, living in and around the natural environment, and seeing the impact that humans can have. I used to live in quite a green area. There were many woodlands and forests. And I always used to be quite shocked at how people would just throw their trash out there without thinking about it. And it really stuck in my mind that we need to find a way to live in harmony with the planet and the environment, rather than just destroying it for our own convenience. And, you know, that, as you might expect, that stuck in my mind and made something of a personal philosophy, and made me want to change these things so that we can support a more healthy lifestyle globally in the global society. And as I said, I received a lot of support when I was young. So I really like to come here and talk to you guys and try and give you that support as well. I was very inspired when I was younger. So I want to drive your passion, drive your inspiration. We need people like you to come into the field and give us your perspective. It's very important. So hopefully some of what I talked to you about today will be useful, and you'll be able to carry that forward into your future professional and academic lives. But anyway, let's get on to the more interesting stuff, which is SDG 12. Obviously, one of the 17 goals for the SDGs. I think it's quite an interesting goal as well, because there are many quite obvious, well, direct and indirect linkages with the other SDGs. Some of these are more easy or more difficult to link together than others. So something that I wanted to begin on was to ask you to tell me, what links do you think there are between SDG 12, and the other SDGs. I didn't put this one in Slido because I didn't expect 36 people, but you can feel free to raise your hand. Is there any brave person in the chat among us today who would like to raise their hand and give an example of a link between SDG 12 and another SDG? Anybody at all? Okay, fair enough. We're all a bit shy. That's okay. So I think SDG 12, obviously the most interesting, well, the most direct one, I think, is with sustainable cities and communities. Obviously, many of us now living in the urban environment, and our responsible consumption directly affects that in terms of our trash output, in terms of our solid waste, in terms of our wastewater and things like this. But I think you can highlight some less obvious links as well, such as between poverty and SDG 12, so SDG 1 there, and SDG 4 as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, in terms of poverty, sometimes our responsible consumption and production relies on financial means or relies on the capacity to make these decisions, right? So if people are stuck in a poverty trap, if they're really scraping by to survive, then a responsible consumption lifestyle isn't really a priority for somebody like that. So lifting people out of poverty first to allow them to consume responsibly, to produce responsibly, is very important. And in many ways, quality education goes hand in hand in that. Many people around the world, including myself sometimes, are somewhat confused about what responsible consumption is, how to do that, which parts of the responsible consumption solutions that we hear are really that responsible and really that effective. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But yeah, just to highlight a couple of links between the two. This is normally how we look at the SDGs. Obviously, these indicators are taken from the SDG dashboard. But there are many, many more indicators for SDG 12 than this. I think there's about 13 and about 11 targets officially. Not all of them get shown on the dashboard though. So normally we use the dashboard like this, and I'm sure you've come across it, but just in case, let me explain a bit about how this works. We have this traffic light system here. You can see a pretty good example of it here on the screen, where electronic waste for both countries, the UK and Korea, two countries I care about very much, both have this red light on electronic waste, which means they haven't met their target. They're not doing enough to meet a target. And those two dots next to it mean that there's no data available. So this is a big challenge for both the UK and Korea, according to the dashboard, where no target has been met and no data is available. Not very useful for us. Immediately below that, if we look at the next indicator, production-based SO2 emissions, you can see a green light, which means that the target has been met. Again, there's no data for this one. So you might question, well, how do they know that the target's been met? We can talk about that a bit later. But that's generally how that works. And then you can see the kind of orange light below that for the UK, which means significant challenges remain to meeting the goal. And on the right-hand side, if you look down along Korea's list and go down to nitrogen emissions embodied in imports, you can see the yellow light, which means some challenges remain. So really, in the scale of positive actions, you want to see the green light most of all. The yellow light is below that, then the orange, and then of course the red, meaning not very much is going on at all. And then of course we have those kind of arrows indicating stuff as well. So a straight up arrow, as in the production-based nitrogen emissions, means that progress is being made, good progress. Sometimes you see it at an angle like that, which means moderate progress is being made. If it's flat like this, as in the nitrogen emissions for Korea, that means progress is stagnating or it's not progressing very fast. And then, of course, if you see an arrow going in any of these directions, it means you're going the wrong way, basically. So you don't want to be doing that. But you can see here for both the UK and Korea, they're doing a lot of stuff right. But, you know, there's some significant progress to be made, particularly on electronic waste. Right, so this is where I want to ask you some questions before I get into some examples and case studies and stuff like that. So in your opinion, guys, what do you think is the biggest problem for for responsible consumption and production? And what I mean by that is, what is stopping us from being able to consume responsibly or produce responsibly? Do you think, for example, we don't know enough? Do you think it's the government's fault? Do you think companies don't have the incentives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm going to go through and wait for a couple of you to talk about this. Yeah, education, excellent. So education, I think, of course, one of the major issues that a lot of us face, and we feel that very personally. Competition among companies, yeah, absolutely. Companies need to make a profit. They're beholden to their shareholders. So this responsible consumption and production thing becomes a little bit of a secondary objective. Greenwashing, absolutely. Yeah, we see a lot of greenwashing. Pay very close attention to COP27 as well. You'll see a lot of greenwashing going on there, I'm sure. But you need to pay close attention to what's being said to make sure greenwashing isn't being enacted. Lack of interest, or you're coming through thick and fast now. Lack of interest, government policies, profit maximization, capitalism, people getting used to convenience, lack of consensus. Great, you guys are really highlighting some key points. Lack of consumer responsibility as well, absolutely, yeah. Very easy for us to think about, you know, our one contribution to irresponsible consumption production isn't that big of a deal, so we can tend to be quite lazy on that. Lack of methods to give responsibility. Yeah, fast changing trends, lacking policies. Absolutely. I think all of these are really great answers so far. What I'd like to ask you today, if possible, would somebody be brave enough to unmute themselves and explain why they've given the answer that they've given? This isn't mandatory, but if you could, I think it would be very nice. Would anybody like to do that? Feel free to just unmute and talk. No? Okay, fair enough. I understand. Right, so yeah, we've got some really lovely examples here. Great, I think all of those are really great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through just three. We can't talk about all of these today because we've only got a very short amount of time, and I want to leave 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. But yeah, let's talk about just three that I think are really significant for responsible consumption and production. The first one that I'm going to talk about is this one, the reliance on fossil fuels. They currently supply about 80% of the world's energy. It's a really significant number, maybe not as high as you might have thought, maybe lower than you might have thought. But it's a significant number, and they're very hard to displace, despite all of the achievements that we've made so far. And importantly, when thinking about fossil fuel use in terms of consumption and production, we have to ask, what's keeping us hooked on them? We can produce so many things, but if we're producing them using sustainable materials, that's great. But if that's being fueled by fossil fuel powered electricity and heat, then, well, we're still losing the battle. So why are we so addicted to fossil fuels? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can think about this. The first one is that existing infrastructure is designed to accommodate fossil fuels. Now, if you can think about this in many ways, and this is beginning to change a bit, especially in the most developed countries. But if you imagine, for example, Japan, which I believe has got significant investments now in liquefied natural gas. The infrastructure to facilitate something like that is massive, and it takes huge amounts of money, huge amounts of time, and huge amounts of effort. So when this infrastructure is in place, of course, there's a great resistance to changing over. You don't want to swap to something else. You've just put all your money into this. It's the same, for example, if you just buy the brand new iPhone or something like that, you're not going to buy the next iPhone the next year, right? Because you want some return on your investment. You want something to come out of it. So you can really approach it in a very similar mindset to that. Obviously, some of the older infrastructure, such as coal, is still very important as well for transporting coal, but becoming less so as renewables become cheaper and cheaper. LNG, though, is a big sticking point. Actually is a bit of a contentious point as well, because many people see this as a greener option to existing power supplies, even though it's not green, it's a fossil fuel. So yeah, existing infrastructure is one. Number two, you all know this already. Typically, it's cheaper than the alternative, especially coal. This is where coal really makes its case. And especially in places like China, where there's huge energy demand and it's not easy to scale up greener options quickly. So typically, coal would be cheaper. This is beginning to change with the introduction of cheaper solar and to a certain extent wind, but not so much yet. Some people might respond to this by thinking, well, what about nuclear? Nuclear is very, very cheap, extremely cheap. And I would agree with you. It is very cheap and it is very feasible as an option, but normally it gets wrapped up in political concerns. The most obvious example of that being Germany, who decided to phase out their nuclear option a long while back. I think they're starting to reverse this opinion now. But in an area like Germany where there's relatively low political tension, it can be quite confusing as to why on earth you would phase out nuclear. But it's just the way it is. Sometimes politics isn't necessarily as straightforward as we'd wish it to be. So typically cheaper than alternatives. And then the third one. This one is more of a technical aspect, but we're better able to control the output of these power plants that use fossil fuels. And the best way to think about this, I think, is when we think about wind or solar. So these two forms of generation, they're very sporadic. They don't happen all the time. They don't happen at the same amount. And when electricity is generated, you have to use it because we don't have enough storage technology yet to compensate for overproduction. So if the sun is shining, if the wind is blowing, we have to be using that electricity, or we have to turn off the power plant itself and say, okay, the wind is blowing, but we can't afford to take you onto the grid right now. The difference with fossil fuels is, of course, you get to control when the electricity is produced, which makes it very, very attractive. If suddenly it's a very cold day outside and everybody turns on their central heating system, you need to ramp up supply to deal with that. If the wind and the sun isn't cooperating, then coal and gas will be the go-to. So this really is one of the mainstays of why fossil fuels remain so prevalent around the world, in addition to these other issues. Obviously, there are many, many more than this. It's a very complex issue, but just to keep it kind of short and sweet for now. Let's move on to the second thing then. A lot of you talked about this already, and I very much agree. There's a lack of knowledge. And what is responsible? What does that even mean? When we talk about it, it's not very easy for us to know as consumers. It's not even easy for producers to know whether or not they're producing in a responsible way. And one of my good friends at the moment at KAIST is working on a thesis regarding this, actually, trying to help producers to understand where their materials have come from, how they were made, who interacted with them at what stages. So, really verifying the supply chain so that we understand whether or not what we're doing is responsible. But then, you can broaden this out. Responsible in what sense? There are many ways to be responsible. Are we talking environmentally responsible, morally responsible? Are we giving people the conditions and pay that they require for working in these things? What is responsible for us? All very difficult things to consider. Somebody in the previous Slido section mentioned clothing, and this is actually where I was going to bring the example of clothing. So all of you, obviously, as am I, are wearing clothes today, but how much do we know about those clothes? Where do they come from? And what materials are they using? I definitely don't know what the material of this coat is, even though I get it dry cleaned every now and then. I don't remember. I can't remember, because people like you and me and everybody else around the world, we have there's so many other things to think about in our daily lives, so much to compute, that these sorts of things are very difficult to take on as additional responsibilities. But should we think about them? Yes, we should. But we can't afford to go through and research these things by ourselves. So we need some systems in place that would help us to do that, to make it easier. Things like my friend Keist is suggesting, which would bring some of that information to consumers as well. Many solutions are being proposed to this at the moment, and a lot of it does revolve around bringing information to consumers at the point of sale, either through QR codes or through information online, things like this, which would give you this information about the material, how it was made, who made it, where, under what conditions, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this lack of knowledge would be addressed in that way. But if we think more fundamentally, and something that I haven't put on here, the education about this to begin with. Obviously, all of us here are relatively educated in this field, because we're here talking about it today, but most people wouldn't go this far. So you really have to think, at what level are people understanding this to be an issue? For me personally, I'm not a big fashion guy. I'm not really into clothing and the supply chain of materials. So I wasn't really aware of this issue before I started learning about it a couple of years back. It wasn't really something that crossed my mind. But of course, now we're becoming more fashion conscious, more sustainable, consumption conscious, and beginning to think about these issues more and more. I'm going to bring to you one more now, and this is the continued use of harmful or unsustainable materials. Kind of similar, but the one I wanted to talk about specifically is our good old friend plastic. We know it, we love it, and we hate it. And we're really hooked on plastic. It's a really useful material, and unfortunately, not very easy to recycle, as it turns out. This is the figure from the US in 2018, where only about 9% of their plastic was recycled. This differs by the type of plastic, of course. I think if you're using PET, it goes up to about 28% recycled. But still, this isn't a good amount of material to be recycled. So what is keeping us hooked on plastic? Why do we continue to use this material, which, quite clearly we can't reuse that much and ends up in landfill? Well, I think a part of the issue here is that we really tend to overplay recycling as a solution. Of course, recycling is helpful. However, I think there's a lot of responsibility passed down from companies to consumers, based on the promise that this will be recycled. I'm sure many of you right now have plastic bottles and stuff in your house, and you're going to take that out later and put it in the recycling and feel like, yeah, I've done my job, I've put it in the right recycling place, and that's the end of it. But unfortunately, it's not. It doesn't just get recycled so easily. So really overplaying this aspect, as opposed to reducing the amount that can be used in the first place, I think is a bit of a critical issue. Of course, very useful for companies, so it's quite hard to change that. The other issue here is that cheap materials increase consumer purchasing power. So when, for example, if you are introducing products into developing economies where financial means and financial capacity is quite low, and even we rely on this as well. Using cheap materials as a base for your product increases the amount of people that can buy it. It increases the access of this product and services to other people. And we use this every day. A lot of our, I'm sure a lot of us would be very, very put off if our goods suddenly increased in price because the materials that we were using became more sustainable. So really, it's a basis of consumer purchasing power. And also there's a lack of materials to fulfill similar roles. Now, that's not to say there are not materials. There are materials that can do each of the roles, of course. But a lot of the issue comes down to, well, plastic is so useful overall. It can fill all of the roles in one go. So for example, I'm sure many of you have seen metallic straws if you've been out to get some coffee sometimes in restaurants and stuff like that. Well, of course, metal can be an alternative to plastic. But if you think about packaging of materials and stuff like that, which also uses plastic, well, metal's heavy. So suddenly your shipping costs increase, your packaging costs increase, so on and so forth, and suddenly it's not economically viable. So really, I would say the lack of alternative is in this cheapness and this malleability of the material to fulfill a variety of roles in one go. I just looked at the time. I'm spending too much time talking. Sorry, guys. I'll go quicker. This is a bit of a difficult slide to look at, but all you need to really see here are the lines. These are total emissions by country over time. And this stretches from 1990 to I think 2020. Really, the point to highlight here is that industrialization and development relies on production by any means. And normally that means the cheapest and most dirty means possible. Just to highlight this graph up in the top left is China. This one here is India. That's Bangladesh. That's Indonesia. And then over here we have the Japan and the UK. So you can see the difference between the countries that need to industrialize, need to produce more in order to grow their economy, and the countries that have already achieved it and have the luxury of choosing the more sustainable option. And just to add on to this point as well, it's very important not to demonize the likes of China, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia for doing this. This is the way to increase the quality of life of your citizens and increase material wealth, increase financial wealth, increase everything. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect method and it has very unsustainable outcomes. But you cannot blame them for doing it. It's certainly what other countries did in the past. And you can see, you know, the UK used to be much higher than Indonesia, much higher than Bangladesh, much higher than many countries, but is now bringing itself down. I'm going to skip over this one a little bit because I feel like you probably know it. We've only got about 15 minutes more. Right, okay. So we've talked about these problems. You've given me a lot of problems. After this, I'm going to talk about what people are doing to combat this and to, you know, bring some solutions to the field. But before I do that, I want to ask you, what do you think are good solutions? What do you think would help us to overcome this issue? You don't have to pick the most technical problems. It doesn't have to be, you know, how to integrate solar and wind into the grid system. It could be something as simple as, what do you think would be a good way of educating people, and things like this. So please feel free to share your solutions. Again, at the end, I'm going to ask if anybody would be brave enough to unmute, but there is a large group here, so if you feel shy, it's totally fine. I understand. But yeah, let's have a look. Civic movements, absolutely. We actually have somebody who used to, I think both myself and Peter know, called Leon Park. She's organized a civic movement recently based around the global youth climate challenges. Sharing accurate information about the current status. I couldn't agree more with that. That's a really great solution. Very hard to bring to people, but is becoming easier and more focused on over time. Giving incentives to companies. Yes, absolutely. I agree with that as well. Education startups, environmental education to children. Absolutely. Yeah, we're really touching on the education part here. Government policies. That's an interesting one. I really do agree with government policies. Of course, the regulation that they put in place is what determines what companies have to do, and consumers as well. So we could look to the government and say, well, why are these policies not stronger? Increased tax rates for producers. That's a very interesting one. I like that. Change in awareness. Yes, we do need to bring more awareness, ESG regulations and standards, incentives and taxes, the carrot and the stick at the same time. That's a really great one. Yeah, there's a couple of systems out there that do similar things to that. Understandable index to consumers. Yeah, actually, that's quite true. Especially if you go in looking at the official indicator list of the SDGs, it gets a bit complicated. There are many tiers to them. So what do I think for the average person who wants to look at this and understand their impact, or the impact the companies are having, it's a bit too much. More countries to act with the UN by making treaties. Yes, absolutely. But international cooperation is very difficult to enact, as you'll be seeing right now at COP. Incentive to consumers, great. Yeah, I think that's another really good way to think about it. And I think it's an understated approach as well. Getting people to care, quite a vague response, but I do agree. How would you get people to care though? People are very, very busy. Education about specific results, good. Yeah, force companies to force them. Yeah, force them to write their reports. Annually, yes. I think that would be a really nice way. I don't know if they'd like the force terminology, but I do agree with you. Nudge them, yes, and behavioral economics as well. Good to see that in here as well. Those are all really lovely solutions, guys. So thank you so much. I'm gonna give you an opportunity. Does anybody want to unmute and share their opinion more broadly? Can see a couple of people smiling. Yes, go for it, please.
I can try.
Yeah.
I thought that it'll be very hard for companies to give up their potential profits. So I thought that it's very important for the government to support them and help them by giving incentives and helping them to try out more different ways to save the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I really agree. Bringing incentives to companies is always a good way to get them to do something, of course, because they are largely money and profit driven. So I think the government incentives are a good way. And oftentimes, though, the government incentives can be a source of backlash from civil society. Of course, incentives can be funded by tax in some parts. So there's a really difficult balance to strike there. But yeah, of course, the companies are the main producers, so getting them to act is the most important way, almost at any cost, I think. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Cheers. Does anybody else want to open up now that we've had one brave person?
Hi, my name is Minji, and I've suggested increased tax rates for producers. So it's a bit similar to Hyewon, but my focus was on regulation for companies, and that could be done by tax rates. That's yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mindy. Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think increasing the tax rates on producers based on how they produce would be a really good way to go about it. And not necessarily, well, kind of related to this, we have some similar systems that are growing in popularity across the world, which are not necessarily, well, some of them are based on tax, but there are basically emissions tax systems or emissions trading systems. There are a couple of ways to implement that, but they very much pass the responsibility to the companies and say, based on how much you're doing, on how you're doing it, we're going to ask you to get these many credits, blah 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 blah, and pay based on that. I'll try to skip over it because I'm going to go into nerd mode and start talking about it if I'm not careful. So anybody else that wants to unmute?
I felt that people who are not interested in this field often do not know what exactly the problem is. And also many ask whether their efforts are really helpful about solving this problem. So I thought that more specifically, there are places to tell those people what kind of efforts are really effective or how those efforts are really helping to solve their problems will be really great to make more people to contribute to this area.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yugang. I really agree with that as well. Of course, information being the bedrock upon which we have to make our decisions. So delivering information about what is effective, of course, is going to be a great way to do that. And then, of course, we encounter the issue of what happens when the information is being manipulated, such that companies or governments even distort their actions to look better than they are, or to mislead people who would take action. But yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else before we move on? Nope. Okay. Thank you so much for that. It was really great to hear you guys speaking out as well. I really enjoyed that. Right. I'm going to go through this a bit more quickly because I've only got about 5 or 10 minutes before I want to open up the floor to you more broadly for some Q&A. But I just wanted to bring to you 3 quick examples of what people are doing to address some of these issues. And this is one that I found from the UNDP. It's their SDG investor platform. And of course, bringing money into this space to fund the projects that are enabling sustainable development, sustainable consumption and production is critical. Just like us not knowing which efforts are available and which ones are producing outputs, investors are the same. They really struggle to put these pieces together and figure out where the opportunities are. So this is something that UNDP has been doing to try and overcome that. So the first thing that they do, of course, is they aggregate ongoing projects for easy access. You can see an example here on the right-hand side. They've got 3 projects there from Sri Lanka, India, and Cambodia. And they also provide like some analysis and some highlighting of the investment opportunities. So if you look just to the bottom of those panels, you can see the time frame, the estimated market that they have, the indicative rate of return, and so on and so forth. So bringing this information to investors that would otherwise be relatively lost out there and maybe go for more traditional investments is something that I think is a really worthwhile way to begin to tackle sustainable production at a fundamental level before we even get into these issues of government regulations, before even education policies and stuff like that. So this is just one example of something that they've been doing. Probably a more typical example of what the UN and many other organizations do is building SDG 12 into its projects. So there's an example here from Tunisia, where the United Nations Environment Programme worked together with the government of Tunisia to develop this thing called Switch Med. And basically what they did here was develop something called a Sustainable Consumption and Production National Action Plan. The UN never makes very easy to say names, that's for sure. But this is basically what they made in collaboration with each other. And importantly, the United Nations was supporting the government to make this. So it wasn't just, we're going to tell you what to do. It should be this. They worked together collaboratively with the Tunisian government to identify priorities, to provide them support where the capacity is lacking, and ultimately to investigate these sectors that you can see at the bottom. They investigated a lot, but only 2 action plans came out of this in the end. And these 2 action plans are, as you can see here, the first one being a 10-year agri-food action plan. I believe this was made in 2016, so this runs up until 2025. And essentially, they're looking at all the negative inputs that go into agriculture and agri-food. So we're talking about things like pesticides, waste, that could be wastewater, it could be food waste, sustainable agricultural practices as well, to make sure that things that are being produced are not being produced in ridiculous ways that are making a misuse of resources. So for example, in Tunisia, of course, very hot country, you want to make sure that the crops that you're growing there are of the correct specification and can withstand the heat of Tunisia. They shouldn't be something like winter wheat, for example, which requires not so high temperatures. And then, of course, ensuring the sustainable nature of agricultural activity as well. So this is one of the outputs, but they also made a 10-year tourism plan. So very, very far removed from agricultural production, and maybe not something that we always think about in terms of sustainable consumption. But how do you build this into a tourism plan? Well, they thought about waste management in particular and recycling. Of course, tourism, if tourists are coming to an area, they need accommodation, they need to get rid of their waste somewhere, whether solid or otherwise, and they need somewhere to go. And of course, if you're going to make tourism as well, one of the things that you can build upon is the appeal of locally produced goods, locally produced souvenirs and things like that. And you need to make sure that these are being made in sustainable ways as well. It's no good to produce things that are made locally. And, that is one of the solutions that often gets put across for sustainable production, if it's being made in really bad ways. So it's very important to build these things into each other. We can talk about this more a little later, but I'm going to skip on from now and just quickly cover the final example, which is what we've been doing with GGGI, or what I've been doing with GGGI. And my work in GGGI targets Uzbekistan specifically. I work in something called the Aral Sea Green Rehabilitation Investment Program, which hopefully you can see my mouse. It targets this little area up here, which is an area called Karakal, Pakistan, and these 2 bodies of water up the top are the Aral Sea, or what's left of it anyway. And what we try to do here is keep responsible consumption and production in mind while we produce solutions for farmers and local people to overcome climate change challenges, to overcome the impacts of natural disasters, to overcome the impacts of COVID, which was something that we focused on at the beginning of our project. But more importantly, to make sure that they can develop and enjoy a greater quality of life, a greater quality of health, a greater quality of education, and so on and so forth. So some of the ways that we had to do this, targeting farmers in particular, we tried to figure out, well, they need to use fertilizers, but how can we make it so that these fertilizers are being A, responsibly produced, and B, responsibly consumed? And one of the ways that we came up with to do this was to make homemade fertilizers. There's a number of ways that they can do that using the leftovers from their farm and from their agricultural produce, without having to resort to chemical fertilizers, which are extremely harmful, and even having to purchase other natural fertilizers from other vendors. So in many senses, this is both responsible in terms of the way it's produced, but also limits the financial expenditure of these farmers as well, and lets them target that money, funnel that money into other more worthy investments. And this is similar ways to protect crops without harmful pesticides. I think we all know at this point that pesticides are very useful, but they're not very sustainable, and they're not very responsible in many ways. They have great impacts on local biodiversity, the health of people living nearby in the wrong conditions. They have great potential to feed into water sources, particularly groundwater, and make those sources of water degrade in quality and have negative health impacts as a result. So we were thinking, okay, they are using these pesticides obviously to great use, but how can we eliminate the use of pesticides as much as possible, and help them to protect their crops in other ways? And a lot of this has to do with things like growing crops in greenhouses and using more environmentally friendly ways to protect crops from pests there, such as by steaming the greenhouse or flash freezing the greenhouse. There's even a solution which might sound a bit funny, but it's you put a bunch of onion peels in a bucket and pour hot water on it and leave it in there for 24 hours and it kills a bunch of bugs. So, we have these very natural solutions to overcoming these pest issues, which don't necessarily require the use of irresponsibly produced and consumed pesticides. And this final one here, is this the final one? No, it's not. This third one here is a really big issue in the region overall, the use of water and the discarding of wastewater. Now, I don't know how much you guys know about Uzbekistan in total, but it's an area that's extremely arid. There's not much rainfall. And for these people that we're targeting right at the very end of the river system, there's not much water for them either, because it gets consumed by all the upstream water users first. So we need to think, okay, how can you responsibly use your water? And more importantly, how can you responsibly discard the water that's now full of whatever it might be, whether it is pesticides, whether it's fertilizer runoff, whether it's salt from the extremely salty soils there. How can you do that? And we've started to talk about a bunch of solutions with these guys regarding the expansion of collector systems for this water, or for the use of water. Then how can you make sure you're not just flooding your fields and wasting your water and having it all evaporate every day? So using very obvious approaches such as drip irrigation systems to responsibly consume water. And why is it that we need to responsibly consume? Well, for the water issue in particular, we talked about the Aral Sea at the beginning of this presentation. There needs to be an effort to allow water to make its way to the Aral Sea, and right now it's not doing that. So responsibly consuming water for not only the good of the environment in terms of the Aral Sea, but also a whole host of knock-on effects that I don't think I've got that much time to explain today, is extremely important. And improving the farm infrastructure and technologies without creating waste. I'll give you one quick example of this. We've talked a little bit about greenhouses already. One very, very cheap way to do that in Uzbekistan is to basically just get a frame made of some kind of metal pipes and then throw a bunch of plastic over the top. And that makes a greenhouse. Super cheap. But of course, it's plastic and eventually it'll wear and tear and needs to be discarded, and then you're discarding plastic. So whether or not that's a really feasible solution or not is something we had to contend with. And we can't always propose the use of these super cheap solutions as a result of that, because we need to think further along. And that really brings me to the final thing that I want to say, which is when implementing these solutions to SDG 12, there's a critical balance that needs to be struck, and that's between the low cost, high waste approaches and the high cost, low waste approaches. And this needs to be tailored to the financial capacity of stakeholders. It's really difficult to do this. It's never perfect. That's being very, very honest. And I think all of our solutions in many, many ways are far from perfect. But to do the best we can and just strike the balance as our analysis and as our thoughts on the matter hold true, is the best that we can really do, short of, you know, coming up with some miracle material that does everything for $0 and 0 cents. So that really would be the critical message that I take away from this. I'm going to stop because I'm about to go way too over time. And I'm going to ask you guys if you've got any questions. You can feel free to ask me now, or if you want to ask me later on, you can use these email addresses on the screen. More than happy to respond to your email. So please feel free to reach out about anything. Doesn't have to just be this presentation either. Just anything you'd like to ask about. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your attention. Cheers.